Everyone laughed. 200 collectors, dealers, and men with more money than patience, and every one of them laughed when Steve McQueen raised his hand to buy that car. They had reason to. Lot 47 was a wreck. A 1965 Shelby Cobra 427, dark blue or what had once been dark blue. The paint had surrendered to the desert. The left fender was caved inward in a long, ugly wound. The windshield was cracked. The seats were split open, foam showing through. The hood wouldn't latch. The engine hadn't started when inspected. No complete title. No original plate. Chassis number obscured by a welded patch that nobody could explain. Ferraris and Jaguars and Porsches gleamed under the Monterey auction lights that Saturday in the fall of 1968. They sold fast, to men who knew exactly what they wanted. Then they rolled in the Shelby. The handler pushed it from the side, embarrassed by the company it was keeping. The auctioneer Gerald Foss, 20 years behind that podium, a man who had learned not to show surprise, read from his card without enthusiasm, found abandoned behind a closed gas station near Barstow. No known previous owner, as is condition, opening bid, $1. $1. That was when they laughed. Victor Henshaw laughed loudest. He was in the third row, silver hair, dark suit open at the collar, a watch that caught every light in the room. He turned to the man beside him, Leonard Pierce, and said something that made Pierce smile. Both of them looked at the Shelby the way certain men look at things they've already finished dismissing. That car's been in a flood, or worse, Pierce said, loud enough for the rows nearby to hear. Could have been used to move something they didn't want found. The chassis number alone makes it untouchable. Heads nodded. A photographer raised his camera out of boredom, took one shot, and lowered it again. Foss asked if anyone cared to open at $1. No one moved. Then a hand went up in the seventh row. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just a hand, steady and relaxed, from a man sitting with his jacket open and his sunglasses still on top of his head, as though he had arrived from somewhere else entirely and hadn't bothered to adjust. Dark jeans, plain shirt, the kind of jacket that belonged to someone who actually used it. Gerald Foss paused for exactly half a second, long enough for anyone watching him closely to catch the slight recalibration behind his eyes, the recognition of a face he had not expected to see. $1, Foss said. Do I have two? Silence. Several people turned to look at the man in the seventh row. Several of those people looked toward Henshaw, the way people do when they want to know how to feel about something unexpected. Henshaw was already looking at the seventh row. His expression had shifted not to alarm, not yet. Just the careful confusion of a man who has been handed a small puzzle and hasn't decided whether it matters. Going once, Foss said. Going twice. 2 seconds of silence that felt much longer. Sold. For $1. Scattered laughter. Someone near the back said something that no one repeated. Gerald Foss moved to the next lot, and the Shelby sat under its single spotlight, dented, cracked, still while the room's attention pulled away from it like a tide that had already moved on. Steve McQueen did not look at anyone around him. He wrote something in a small notebook, put it away, and looked at the Shelby one final time. His jaw was set, his eyes were calm and entirely specific. He was not amused. He was not performing. He had made his decision the night before, during a private viewing, when he had crouched beside the open driver's door and angled a flashlight at the inside rim of the steering wheel. 4 words, carved into the wood by someone who needed them to last. For Danny Run Free, he had paid $1 for the most important object in that room, and no one in it understood why. Not yet. Spring of 1965. The Mojave Desert. A film production had moved a chase sequence to a stretch of road outside Palm Springs, and the heat was the kind that shimmered off the blacktop in visible waves and made the distant mountains look like they were dissolving. Temperature at 95 before 10 in the morning. The location scout had promised shade, which turned out to be a generous interpretation of the terrain. Steve was not the kind of man who spent time between takes, sitting in a trailer waiting to be called. He walked. He examined things. He asked questions of crew members who were used to the talent staying well clear of the practical side of things and who seemed to appreciate, even when they didn't say so, being spoken to as people with knowledge worth hearing. He listened to engines the way certain people listen to music, with genuine and sustained attention, and with something close to pleasure in understanding what he was hearing. On the third day of the shoot, He was standing near a cluster of equipment vehicles during a lighting setup when a sound from one of the camera chase vehicles made him stop mid-step. It was a slight irregularity in the idle, a tiny hesitation between pulses, almost nothing, the kind of sound most people categorize as acceptable variation and move past. But Steve had spent enough years around machines to know that specific sound was not acceptable. That hesitation meant the carburetor was pulling air at the wrong moment in its cycle, and if nobody caught it before the camera car went to speed on the next take, the engine could lose power unpredictably, possibly at the moment the camera car needed to hold pace with the vehicle it was following. He walked toward the sound. He found a young man with his head under the hood of the vehicle, but not working yet, just listening. His ear was practically touching the engine block. His eyes were half closed. He was completely absorbed in what he was hearing, with the focused expression of someone translating a language that doesn't use words. He was about 22 years old. Lean, with forearms that looked older than his face, the way a mechanic's forearms do, built by work rather than by intention, stained with the specific history of oil that never fully washes out. He wore a shirt with the sleeves cut off, and jeans faded from repeated washing to the color of a winter sky. There was a small scar on his chin that caught the afternoon light. When his hands finally moved, they did so with a slow deliberateness, the deliberateness of someone who had learned that patience with machines is not optional, it's the difference between a fix and a mistake. Steve waited. He stood back and gave the young man the space the concentration required. Not everyone would have thought to do that. After a moment, the young man reached into the engine compartment and made a single adjustment that took less than 30 seconds. He stood back. He listened again. The idle smoothed into something completely even, the engine settling into itself like a man finding the right position after a long time uncomfortable. "Carburetor," Steve said. The young man turned around. He took in Steve's face with a brief recognition that he did not perform or announce. He simply absorbed it and moved forward. "Float needle was catching," he said. "Intermittent problem. Would have been fine at low speed. At high speed, you'd have felt it. Could have cost you a take, or worse. You heard that from 20 feet away?" "I heard it when the vehicle came in this morning," the young man said. "Been waiting for a good moment to check it." He picked up a rag from the fender and wiped his hands with the efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times between each finger, through the palm, folding the rag and putting it back precisely where it had been. Steve looked at him. "What's your name?" "Danny." "Danny Mercer. Who do you work for right now?" "Whoever needs it," Danny said. He said it without bitterness, just fact. "I'm trying to get in with one of the racing teams in Los Angeles. I've made calls. Nobody's come back yet." "You work on racing engines specifically, or general mechanical?" "Both," Danny said. "But racing is where I think. I've been building a Shelby in a rented space in Van Nuys on my own, Cobra 427. I source all the parts myself and do everything by hand. It's slower that way, but I know what's in it, and I know why." He said it without needing anything back from it. He wasn't pitching. He was answering a question. Steve looked at the engine, the clean adjustment, the recovered idle, the quality of work done in under a minute by a man who had prepared for it by listening for hours. "My personal car's been running rough in third gear," Steve said. "Something in the synchro or the linkage, I can't isolate which. You want to take a look at it after they wrap today?" Danny said yes without making anything of it. That evening, after the cameras were done and the desert light had turned everything gold, Danny spent an hour with Steve's vehicle in the lot behind the location trucks. He found the problem a worn pivot pin in the shifter assembly, allowing just enough play to disturb the gear engagement at the specific pressure required for third, and fixed it with a part he made himself from a bolt in his toolbox. A modification, he explained, step by step while he worked, not because he was asked to, but because it was how his mind worked through solutions, out loud, in detail. He didn't charge anything. He said it was the kind of work he would have done anyway, to see if he could get it right. Before they parted, Steve pulled a card from his wallet. Frank Dillard, a small racing team in the Crenshaw district of Los Angeles. Not famous, no glamour, but legitimate real entries in real regional events, and a reputation for giving talent a chance when the history wasn't there yet. "Tell him I sent you," Steve said. Danny took the card carefully, holding it at the edges the way you hold something you don't want to bend. "I'll find a way to pay you back," Danny said. "Don't," Steve said. He put his jacket on and looked at the sky, which was going deep orange above the ridgeline and purple at the edges. "Just don't waste it." Danny called Frank Dillard the next morning. Frank answered. The door opened. The Shelby Cobra 427 dark blue, almost finished, was Danny's project for his first race entry. He was completing it in the Van Nuys space at night, after day shifts, eating badly and sleeping short, and finding the work completely worth it. He had a notebook full of specifications and adjustment records, and projected lap times written in his careful, small handwriting. Every part had been selected deliberately for what it contributed to the whole. He knew that car the way you know something you have thought about from every angle. On the inside rim of the steering wheel, one evening when the radio was playing something slow and the space was quiet, he carved 4 words into the wood with the small blade he carried for trim work. A private message to his father, a man named Earl, who had flown 2 wars and returned, and raised his son with few words and clear values about what it means to be a man who doesn't stop. For Danny Run Free. He planned to show Earl the car before the first race. He planned to drive the 2 hours to Barstow and let the old man sit in the driver's seat and hear the engine running. Earl wouldn't say much. He never did. But it would be enough. He never got the chance. Because someone had already decided that Danny Mercer needed to disappear. Victor Henshaw had built his public reputation over 15 years, and it was immaculate from the outside. He owned 4 dealerships in Southern California that sold European cars to men who could afford not to ask about the price. He sponsored regional racing events under a banner of civic generosity, showing up at finish lines with a check and a photographer positioned to capture the handshake. He appeared in photographs with city officials, studio people, and retired athletes. His Pasadena offices were decorated with framed race programs and signed photographs of drivers who did not know him well but whose names looked good on walls. He spoke with the practiced conviction of a man who had not been meaningfully contradicted in a long time, and there was a reason for that. Danny Mercer was not the first. Before Danny, there had been a driver named Lyle Carson, a young man from Fresno with genuine talent and a stubborn sense of integrity. Lyle had questioned, in writing, the outcome of a race in which he had clearly finished second but been listed as fourth. Within a month, Leonard Pierce had produced documentation suggesting Lyle had tampered with a competitor's fuel line. The story held. Lyle lost his racing license. He left California. He never came back. Before Lyle, there had been a team manager named Al Grover who had refused to sign off on a result he knew had been arranged. Al's garage burned down 3 weeks later. The insurance investigation found nothing. Al rebuilt, quietly, and said nothing more about race outcomes. Victor Henshaw's weapon was not violence. It was something more efficient. He weaponized reputation. He understood that a man's name, once damaged with enough voices confirming the damage, became impossible to repair without evidence, and he was careful about evidence. He buried it, altered it, or made certain it never existed in the first place. Leonard Pierce was his instrument. Pierce had a doctorate in mechanical engineering and a manner so consistently superior that even his agreement felt like criticism. He authenticated documents, evaluated claims, and delivered verdicts in the tone of a man who has examined all the facts and found them unfortunately clear. His professional word was treated, in certain circles, as the last word. He cultivated this reputation carefully. It was more useful to Victor than money. What neither man advertised was the system they had been running for 6 years. The racing world at the regional level ran on money that moved in unofficial directions, side bets through intermediaries, arranged finishes brokered weeks before race day, results structured in advance by men who would not be at the track when it happened. Victor and Leonard managed this through a network of drivers, officials, team managers, and suppliers who took regular envelopes and said nothing because everyone inside the system had too much to lose by stepping outside it. The system worked because the one thing it could not tolerate was an honest man. Danny Mercer arrived in Frank Dillard's team as a mechanic, which was the correct path. Prove yourself with the machines before you're trusted to drive them. Within 8 weeks, he had done enough with the team's engines to produce measurable improvements in lap times, and Frank had begun having quiet conversations about a test entry for Danny in a minor event early the following year. Danny kept his head down and focused on his work. He was not the kind of man who pushed into conversations he hadn't been invited to, but careful men sometimes see things by accident. In October of 1965, Danny was working alone in the team garage on a Tuesday evening, the rest of the crew gone home. A fuel relay in the number 3 car was intermittent, and he wanted to isolate it before the week's end. He was on his back on a creeper, working under the vehicle, when he reached for a tool and his hand found a manila folder pushed to the back of a low shelf. He might have put it back. He almost did. Instead, and he thought about this choice many times in the years that followed, he opened it. Inside were documents that had nothing to do with race cars, financial records formatted like invoices but with initials where names should be and dollar amounts where services should be described. Race result sheets with handwritten margin notes and circled figures, a typed list of dates with two-letter codes and amounts beside them. Some entries carried the word arranged in parentheses, which was the kind of notation that requires no further explanation. At the back of the folder was a carbon copy of a contract on Henshaw Company letterhead. With that name appearing in a context it had no legitimate business appearing in, Danny spent 30 minutes reading. Then he put the folder back exactly where he'd found it, drove home, and told no one. He thought about it for a full week, turning it from every angle, looking for an interpretation that made it less than what it was. There was no such interpretation available. Then he made the mistake that a 22-year-old makes when he has been raised to believe that the right thing is always the obvious thing. He photographed the documents, made a written record of what they described, and confronted Frank Dillard privately to ask for an explanation. Frank's face gave him the answer before any words did. Frank was not shocked. He was afraid the specific fear of someone who has known for a long time that the day of reckoning was always approaching and who can now see it clearly. 3 days later, Victor Henshaw came to the garage in person. He was polite in the way that men are polite when they want you to understand that politeness is a considered choice, not a reflex. He sat across from Danny and spoke in the measured tone of a man presenting a reasonable solution to a problem he considered resolved. He said that Danny was talented and intelligent. He said that intelligent people in the racing world learned to distinguish between things they observed and things they reported, because this distinction was what separated men with long careers from men without any career at all. Danny listened until Henshaw finished. Then he said he needed time to think. Henshaw left. That evening, the folder was gone from the shelf. The next morning, the filing cabinet in the office had a new lock. 2 days later, Danny vanished. The story that went through the racing community was clean and specific. Danny Mercer had taken money from a side bet arrangement that belonged to other parties and had disappeared before anyone could confront him. Frank Dillard confirmed it without offering details, which made it sound more credible. Leonard Pierce said publicly that Danny had always seemed like the opportunistic type, the kind of young man who views talent as a license. Victor Henshaw said nothing, which in the relevant circles carried its own particular authority. Earl Mercer heard the story from a former driver passing through Barstow. Earl was 61, arthritic in both hands, living alone in a house that needed a new roof. He had served in 2 wars and buried his wife, and raised his son on the belief that a man's character is built by what he does when nobody is watching. When he heard that Danny had stolen money and run, he sat down in his kitchen chair and did not get up for the rest of the day. He never spoke of Danny publicly again. He died in January of 1967, the roof still leaking. A photograph of Danny turned to face the wall on the shelf above the fireplace. 3 years later, in a Monterey auction hall, a car appeared that neither Henshaw nor Pierce had expected to see again. They should have been more careful about what they left behind. Steve McQueen had the Shelby towed to a rented space in an industrial block east of Los Angeles. It was not a dramatic garage. Metal walls, a cement floor with old oil stains worked so deeply into the surface they had become part of its character. Fluorescent lights overhead that buzzed at a constant low frequency. He had cleared the space specifically for this car and put nothing else in it. He spent the first afternoon walking around the Shelby without touching it. This was something he had always done with machines that seemed to carry information he hadn't found yet, not ceremony. It was the systematic habit of someone who knows that patience and observation together find things that impatience alone misses. He believed experience had confirmed the belief that a car left alone long enough begins to tell you where it's been, if you're willing to look without rushing. The Shelby had been stored under cover for most of its years in hiding. The undercarriage showed desert dust calcified into a thin crust in the low points, but the structural steel underneath was solid. No flood damage, no significant corrosion on the frame members. The suspension components were dried out but intact. Brake lines present and uncorroded. Someone had been building this car with a plan and with real knowledge. The engine compartment confirmed it. The components installed were not economy choices. They were selected, each one chosen for what it would contribute to the system, how it would work with the others. The routing was clean. The wiring was organized. The hose connections were properly secured. This was the work of someone who knew what they were doing and cared about doing it right, which are not always the same people. He checked the driver's seat first. The split leather was from age and from desert temperature swings, not neglect. The floor mat on the driver's side held a specific wear pattern from a right boot, the heel depression placed near the brake pedal in the position of someone who drove with discipline. Then he opened the driver's door fully and crouched down to look at the steering wheel. It was a wooden-rimmed wheel, dark with age, polished smooth at the natural grip points by years of use. He turned it slowly by hand, quarter turns, examining the inside rim with the systematic attention of someone looking for something specific. Near the bottom, where the rim met the lower spoke, the wood surface had been worked with something sharp and controlled, not scratched, carved, done with patience and intent, by someone who needed the result to last. He angled his flashlight at the spot. 4 words. For Danny, run free. He sat back on his heels. He looked at those words for a long time. He thought about a young man in a Palm Springs parking lot, listening to an engine with his eyes half closed, making a 30-second fix and explaining it afterward as though the explanation were the interesting part. He thought about a pivot pin machined from a bolt and a card given at the end of a desert afternoon and the specific quality of someone accepting help without making it into a performance. He thought about the story that had circulated, the theft, the disappearance, the verdict delivered without a trial, and the feeling he had carried since then, not quite belief and not quite doubt, just a quiet resistance to accepting that the version he'd heard was complete. He stood, walked to the far end of the garage, poured coffee from a thermos he had brought, drank it standing up, looking at the Shelby from across the room, letting it sit there in the buzzing light. He went back to the car. He opened the hood and looked at the engine, not as an owner assessing damage, but as a mechanic reading a record. The engine had not started when the auction house inspected it, that was accurate. But it had not seized. It had been deliberately shut down and preserved. The spark plugs had been removed, and the holes covered with electrical tape, now brittle and crumbling at his touch. The intention was clear. Someone had put this car away, expecting to return to it. They had not expected to be gone so long. He reached under the dashboard and ran his fingers along the wiring harness. He found a bundle that had been additionally wrapped, taped with more layers than the factory specification required. The bundle caught on something behind the firewall when he pulled. He worked carefully with both hands for 10 minutes, following it back, finding where it connected to something that was not part of any wiring system. He pulled free a small package wrapped in canvas cloth. The rubber band holding it disintegrated at his touch. He set the package on the hood and unrolled the canvas. Inside was a white envelope, yellowed, the flap sealed with tape, the color of old amber. No name on it, no address, nothing on the outside at all. He held it in both hands without opening it. He was thinking about Earl Mercer in Barstow, about what it meant to leave something inside a car that you were not sure you were coming back to, about the specific weight of 4 words carved into wood as a private message from a son to a father. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. He pulled the hood down gently. He walked to his truck, sat in it, held the envelope. He turned it over. On the back, in pencil pressed so lightly the words were barely there, "Tell Earl." He sat in the truck for a long time with the engine off. Outside, the freeway moved. Inside, a 3-year-old secret sat in his jacket pocket, and the man it had been waiting for didn't know it existed. Steve had to find him before Henshaw did. Martha Calloway had not worked in racing since 1966. She kept the books for a printing company in Burbank, work that required accuracy, which she had, and enthusiasm, which she maintained to adequate levels. She lived alone in a 2-bedroom house in Glendale with a small garden she maintained well in good periods and neglected in bad ones. She was 44 years old and looked 10 years older in the mornings. She had a telephone she sometimes let ring without answering it. She had managed the office for Frank Dillard's team for 3 years. This meant she knew every piece of paper, every signature, every conversation that happened in the office versus the ones that happened in the parking lot where the walls had no ears. She was trusted in the way that competent, quiet women in professional environments are often trusted thoroughly and with little thought given to what that trust cost them. She had known about Victor Henshaw's financial arrangement for over a year before Danny Mercer found the folder. She had known because she processed certain invoices when they arrived. She had filed documents she did not ask questions about because asking questions about them would have required acknowledging that she understood what they meant, and understanding what they meant would have made her responsible for doing something about them. And doing something about them was a path that ended with a conversation in a parking lot, which she had eventually had anyway, with Victor Henshaw, in which he said things without saying them. He made the nature of her options entirely clear without creating a record of doing so. She had carried the secret in the way that poisons are carried, not thinking about it directly, staying busy, putting enough physical and professional distance between herself and the source that the distance felt like safety. She had a son in college, a mortgage, a life she had not yet finished building. She told herself what she knew was not enough to be useful. She told herself regularly that it wasn't her responsibility. She had been telling herself these things for 3 years, and they had become consistently less convincing. When Steve McQueen knocked on her front door on a Tuesday evening in October of 1968, she knew immediately why he was there. Not because she had expected him specifically, but because she had always known that a knock would come, and had spent a great deal of time rehearsing her answer, which was that she didn't know anything useful. She opened the door. He didn't introduce himself. He said, "I bought a dark blue Shelby Cobra at auction last weekend. It was Danny Mercer's. I found something inside it, and I want to understand what happened to Danny before I do anything with what I found." She held the door handle. "You want coffee?" She said, "Yes." They sat at her kitchen table, plain white mugs, the kind that hold heat well and make no claims about themselves. The kitchen was organized, controlled, in the way of someone who manages small things carefully when large ones are not in her control. A window above the sink looked onto the garden, where something needed weeding and had needed it for a while. Steve placed the envelope on the table. He did not push it toward her. Martha looked at the envelope. Something tightened slightly at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't know he'd hidden anything in the car," she said. "What do you know about what happened to him?" Steve said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked out the window at the garden. She was quiet for long enough that the refrigerator motor kicked on and filled the silence with its neutral, steady hum. "The folder Danny found behind the shelf," she said carefully, "did not get there by accident. I know because I was the one who filed those documents, and I know exactly where I filed them, and it was not behind a parts shelf. Someone moved them there deliberately." She paused. "I believe someone wanted Danny to find them." "Why?" Steve said. "Because Danny was developing a real reputation as a potential driver. Not just a good mechanic, a real driver. And a driver who couldn't be controlled or purchased was a liability in the structure Henshaw had spent years building." She looked at her mug. If Danny found the documents and panicked and ran, they could smear his name and he'd be gone. If he tried to report them, they could deal with him before he got to anyone who mattered. Either outcome worked for them. What didn't work for them was Danny becoming a credible public figure with access to what he knew. "You think they chose him," Steve said. "I think Victor Henshaw does not leave outcomes to chance." She said, "I think Danny was chosen because he was talented enough to be dangerous eventually, and young enough not to fully understand that yet." Steve was quiet. He looked at the envelope on the table. "I haven't opened it," he said. "I wanted to understand what I was reading before I read it." Martha looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Steve directly. "Open it," she said. "And then tell me what you need me to do." The envelope contained 4 things. The first was a set of 6 photographs, black and white, taken inside an office. Documents laid flat, on a surface, and shot from above. The quality was not professional. Danny had used a camera built for engine documentation, not covert photography, but several images were clear enough to read. The document showed columns of figures, initials in margins, signature lines. In 2 photographs, a hand was partially visible, holding the edge of the paper. The hand wore a ring on the right index finger, a heavy signet style, with an angular monogram that cut a distinctive shape against the paper below it. The second item was a single handwritten page in Danny's small, careful printing, a numbered list of race dates, results, and 2-letter codes that corresponded to drivers or officials. Dollar amounts beside some entries. Beside others, the word "arranged," in parentheses, set off with the quietness of something that does not need elaboration. The third item was a receipt from a Van Nuys hardware store, ordinary on its front. On the back, Danny had drawn a diagram in pencil, a map of relationships. names connected by lines, arrows showing direction of money and authority, notes on which officials were compensated and at what level. The kind of diagram a careful young man makes when he is trying to hold a system too large and dangerous inside his head and needs to put it on paper to understand it fully. The fourth item was a letter, addressed to Earl Mercer. Steve read it without speaking. Martha sat across from him and watched his face the way people watch faces when words are insufficient. The letter was written by a 22-year-old who understood he was in serious trouble and was not certain how it would end. Danny explained what he had found, what he had done with the documentation, and what Henshaw had said to him in their conversation at the garage. He wrote that he had hidden the copies inside the Shelby because the car was the one thing in his life that he completely controlled, that no one touched without his permission, that was entirely his. He wrote that if anyone was reading the letter, it meant something had happened to him and the car had been recovered. He wrote to his father in the final paragraph. He wrote that he knew Earl would hear things about him. He wrote that the things Earl heard would be wrong, and that he understood how difficult it was to fight a story confirmed by multiple people in positions of apparent authority. He wrote that the car contained the truth, and that the truth had always been what Earl said mattered more than anything else. He was sorry he could not say this in person. The last line, "I didn't steal anything, Dad. I didn't run." Steve folded the letter carefully and set it on the table between them. Martha's eyes were bright. She was holding her mug and not drinking from it. "Earl Mercer died in January of '67, Steve said quietly. Martha said nothing for a moment. She looked at her hands. "I know," she said. "Danny doesn't know that yet." The silence that followed had a specific weight to it, the weight of understanding what it meant that Danny had spent 3 years hiding, surviving, waiting to clear his name so he could face his father, not knowing that the chance to face him was already gone. He had lost his career, his name, 3 years of his life, and somewhere along the way, without knowing it, he had also lost the one person he was fighting to protect. Martha set her mug down carefully. "You think Danny might still be alive?" "I think it's worth finding out before anything else," Steve said. He gathered the contents of the envelope and replaced them. "If they pushed him out and Earl is already gone, then who does this belong to?" "It belongs to Danny," Martha said. "And if Danny is gone too, it belongs to the truth." "Then we start with the truth," Steve said. He stood. "Do you remember anyone who might have seen Danny the night he disappeared? Anyone outside the team?" Martha's eyes went to the middle distance, the look of memory working through something it has not revisited in a while. "There was a gas station he stopped at regularly," she said. "Somewhere between Van Nuys and Barstow, an independent place. Danny mentioned it once because the man there sold engine oil at the listed price, without adding his own markup, which Danny appreciated." She shook her head slightly. "I don't remember the name of the place." "I'll find it," Steve said. He thanked her for the coffee and left without making it sound like anything other than the beginning of something that was going to require patience and a specific kind of resolve from people who hadn't planned on needing either. He sat in his truck outside her house for a moment. The street was quiet, ordinary. Somewhere between Van Nuys and Barstow, a man was either dead or living under a name that wasn't his own, carrying 3 years of someone else's lie on his back. Steve started the engine and drove east. The drive east took most of a morning. Steve drove himself, windows down where the speed made the air tolerable. The landscape changed steadily as the road pushed into the desert green, trading away for brown, until the sky became enormous and there was nothing tall enough to interrupt the view from horizon to horizon. It was the kind of driving he had done before, the kind where the distance itself does useful work on the thinking. He had made 2 calls the previous night. One was to a contact at the California Motor Vehicle Department, a man who had owed Steve a favor for 3 years from a practical matter that had required a phone call and cost the DMV man a great deal of relief. Steve asked for any Shelby Cobra 427 registered in California between 1964 and 1965 to anyone with the last name Mercer, with whatever address had been on file. He asked for discretion. The second was to Paul Garrett, a journalist who had covered automotive racing for 15 years, with the kind of accuracy that accumulates enemies in proportion to its quality. Steve told Paul he had found a car with a complicated history and might need documentation help in the near future. Paul said he was listening. Finding the gas station near Barstow took an hour and a half. There were 3 former service locations on the relevant stretch, Two closed completely, and one barely operating, one working pump, a second rusted at the nozzle. A low cinder-block building with a hand-painted sign above the door that read, Bell's Service. The letters were faded, but entirely readable. A man emerged from the back when he heard the truck arrive, about 60. Heavy-set, with the build of someone who had done physical work for 40 years and whose body had kept its shape even as the pace of the work changed. He wore clean coveralls that still carried the memory of what they had been through. He walked with a slight preference for his right leg. His name was Roy Bell. Steve filled the tank and then said, when Roy came to take the money, I'm looking for information about someone who used to come through here. Young mechanic, early 20s, dark blue Shelby Cobra, around 65. Roy Bell went still. Not visibly, to anyone not watching carefully. An interior stillness, the kind a man shows when a description connects to something he has kept in a specific, undisturbed place for a long time. What's your interest? Roy said. I think he's in trouble and doesn't know anyone is looking, Steve said. Roy looked at him directly, with the full attention of a man who has learned to tell the difference between people who are asking and people who are performing asking. You're Steve McQueen, Roy said. Yes. Roy looked at the highway, back at Steve. There was a young man who came through here, he said. Not often, but regularly enough that I knew his face. Polite. Talked about engines. The way other people talk about things they love. He came through late one Thursday night in October of 65. Late enough that the sky was fully dark. He was driving that blue Shelby, and he wasn't driving it right. Not recklessly more, like his hands were on the wheel, but his mind was somewhere else completely. He stopped, Steve said. He pulled in and let the engine run for a minute before he got out. Like he was still deciding whether to stop. I came out. He said he was fine. His hands shook when he paid. He drove east when he left. About 20 minutes later, a black pickup truck went through the same direction, moving fast. 3 men inside. The passenger was looking out the window with attention. You remember anything specific about the truck? A business name on the door. Automotive something, or something automotive. I didn't catch it fully in the dark. A newer truck. Known. Cleaner than what you usually see on that road at night. He paused. I thought about calling the sheriff. I didn't know what I'd say that would mean anything by itself. I've thought about it since. He went inside and came back holding a small key on a plain metal ring between two fingers. He held it out. Steve took it and turned it in the light. On the key ring, scratched in very small letters with something sharp, DMSC, Danny Mercer, Shelby Cobra. Steve closed his fingers around it. He left it deliberately, Steve said. That's what I decided, Roy said. I found it in the gravel the next morning. People don't drop a key like that and just drive on. He looked at his boots. I've kept it. You've done right, Steve said. He shook Roy's hand. Roy's grip said everything that needed saying about the kind of man he was. The trail from Roy Bell's key took 2 weeks and 4 conversations before it went anywhere solid. Steve worked methodically, one connection at a time, checking each before moving to the next. He drove to 3 towns. He made calls to people who had access to things that were not officially accessible, carefully, using only the specific currency of a man whose name opens certain doors and whose discretion has kept them open over years. The lead that mattered came from Eddie Cruz, a former regional driver whose career had ended in a crash near Riverside in the mid-60s. Eddie had heard, through the loose and gossipy network of people who passed through racing at various levels without quite leaving, that a man had appeared in Bakersfield sometime in early 1966 with no clear history. No driver's license for the first 2 years, gaps he couldn't account for, found steady work at a salvage and parts depot on the south side, called himself Cal Harper. Eddie had thought of Danny Mercer when he first heard this description, not because he had evidence, but because the man people described as Cal Harper moved around car parts with an economy and precision inconsistent with someone who had come to mechanical work casually. The quality of his attention read like serious training. He's quiet, Eddie said. People at the depot say he does good work and doesn't cause trouble, and he flinches sometimes when a voice raises. Not frightened exactly, more like a reflex, like his body has a memory that his head is still sorting through. Steve drove to Bakersfield on a Wednesday. The salvage depot was a large operation on the south side of the city, rows of stripped vehicles in lanes that extended far into the lot, a low office building near the gate. When Steve asked for Cal Harper, the man at the gate pointed toward the far end of one of the lanes. Steve walked the length of the property at an ordinary pace, between rows of car bodies in various states of completion and incompletion, past engine blocks pulled and stacked with the pragmatic aesthetics of salvage work. The man working on a transmission at the far end had his back to Steve. He was kneeling beside a vehicle on stands, hands inside the casing, working slowly, thinner than his height, warranted. Hair with gray in it that seemed premature. His hands moved with a deliberateness that was not recently acquired. Steve stopped 10 feet away. "Cal Harper?" he said. The man's hands stopped. His shoulders made a slight, controlled movement. He did not turn immediately. He stayed still for a full breath. Then he turned. His face had aged beyond what 3 years should have produced. A scar above his left eye, thin, running into the hairline. Eyes that were the same dark brown they had always been, but with a quality in them of someone who has been performing calm for a long time and has become less able to turn the performance off. He looked at Steve, said nothing. Steve took the key from his jacket pocket. He held it up just clearly, in the available light. The small initials scratched into the ring. DM-SC. The man called Cal looked at the key. Something shifted at the corners of his eyes. His jaw tightened and released. "Roy kept it," he said. His voice was low and slightly rough with disuse. "He found it the next morning," Steve said. "He's held it since then." A long silence. The yard around them held its ordinary sounds. "Who sent you?" the man said. "Nobody sent me," Steve said. "I bought your car." The man looked at him differently. "The Shelby," Steve said. "It went to auction in Monterey last month. I paid $1 for it. Nobody else would touch it." The man called Cal sat down on a nearby running board. He sat with the weight of someone whose legs had made a decision before the rest of him had. "I thought it was gone," he said. "It wasn't," Steve said, "and neither is what you put inside it." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet at the corners. "My name is Daniel Mercer," he said slowly, testing the weight of it. "I have been Cal Harper for almost 3 years." "I know," Steve said. He sat down on a wheel well nearby, bringing himself to approximately the same level. "They said I stole money and ran," Danny said. "I know what they said. I didn't fully believe it." Danny looked at him with the expression of a man confronting something he had told himself was no longer reasonable to hope for. His hands, still oil dark, hung at his sides. He was trying to hold himself together in the specific way of someone who has been holding himself together for a very long time. "My father," he said. "Earl." He said the name carefully, like touching something that might still be sore. "I need to go back. I need to tell him what actually happened. I need him to know I didn't." He stopped. Steve was quiet. He let the silence sit between them for a moment. "Earl passed in January of '67, he said. "I'm sorry." The words landed the way those words always land all at once, without warning, with a weight that cannot be prepared for. Danny went completely still. The salvage yard continued its ordinary sounds around them. A distant radio, metal shifting somewhere in the rows, indifferent to the fact that something had just broken apart inside a man who had been surviving on the hope of a conversation that was now impossible. He closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long time. When he opened them, there were tears on his face that he did not wipe away. He did not seem aware of them. 3 years, he said. His voice was barely there. "I spent 3 years hiding, trying to survive long enough to go back and explain, trying to survive long enough to look him in the eye and tell him I didn't run." He stopped, and he never knew. "He died not knowing the truth," Steve said. "That is different from dying believing a lie. The difference matters. Does it?" Danny said. "Yes," Steve said. He said it simply and completely. "And there are still people alive who need to hear the truth. That part isn't finished." Danny looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, not quickly, not with relief, but with the slow weight of someone picking something back up that they had set down because they had no choice. He was Daniel Mercer again, and Victor Henshaw did not know it yet. Victor Henshaw had known about the Shelby being purchased within 24 hours of the auction. His sources at California automotive events were reliable and had been reporting back since his arrangement with various organizers made it useful to know who was buying what and why. The buyer being Steve McQueen had been noted and passed along the same day. Henshaw's initial reaction was measured rather than alarmed. The car had been in desert storage for 3 years. Whatever it might once have contained had been subjected to heat, cold, and humidity fluctuations that degraded paper and adhesives and film. And even if something had survived, physical copies without living testimony to contextualize them could not move serious legal machinery. He was not alarmed. Then word came that Steve had driven toward Barstow. Then came the report from Bakersfield. Leonard Pierce brought the second piece in person, which was itself significant. Pierce communicated by phone as a matter of habit. Coming in person meant he had assessed the situation as requiring a conversation that did not exist on any wire. "If McQueen has found Mercer," Pierce said, standing near the window while Henshaw sat at his desk with the stillness of a man choosing not to react prematurely, "we have a specific kind of problem." "We searched the car," Henshaw said. "We found nothing." "We looked in the places people look," Pierce said. "McQueen is a mechanic. He looks in different places." Henshaw considered this with the patience of a man who has spent 15 years converting problems into manageable situations. "Danny Mercer has been living as another person for 3 years," he said. "He has no credible record under his real name. He disappeared by public account because he stole money and ran. His word belongs to a man who does not officially exist." McQueen's word doesn't share that limitation," Pierce said. "McQueen is an actor who pays too much for broken cars at auction," Henshaw said. "That is what this looks like from the outside. We ensure it keeps looking that way." He made 3 calls. The first was to Robert Fant, a specialist in defamation defense. He didn't give Fant specifics. He simply said he wanted the firm on standby, ready to move fast. Fant asked no unnecessary questions. He understood the assignment. The second call was to Martha Calloway's number. He let it ring 4 times. When she answered, he said nothing. He simply held the line for 4 or 5 seconds, long enough for her to understand, and hung up. Martha stood in her kitchen for a while after that, her hand still on the receiver, the dial tone running. The third call went through 2 intermediaries to a man who had access to certain information about storage facilities east of Los Angeles. The question was whether anyone had been asking questions near the garage. The answer came back, yes, twice in 3 days. Henshaw moved that night. The work was professional. The side door lock was defeated cleanly, not broken. Defeated, with a tool that left specific marks only if you knew what to look for. Inside, the dashboard had been partially disassembled and replaced just imprecisely enough to show that someone had been inside it. The seat pulled back from its tracks and repositioned a centimeter wrong. The trunk opened, the spare tire removed, and put back at a slightly different angle. The engine compartment examined thoroughly. The wiring harness checked by someone who knew what they were doing. They had found nothing. The envelope was not there. It had been in a metal lockbox at Steve's home since the first night. But that was not the whole message Henshaw was sending. Steve arrived the next morning and stood outside the garage door for a moment before going in. He read the marks on the lock. He went inside and walked the Shelby with slow, systematic attention. The dashboard, the seat, the trunk, the engine bay, the wiring harness. He took note of what had been moved and what had been missed. He pulled out his notebook and wrote 3 things: the date, the marks on the door, and the search pattern in the order it had been conducted. Then he put the notebook away and looked at the Shelby for a moment. Henshaw knew he had found something. He didn't know what. He didn't know where it was. But he knew Steve had it, and he had just sent a message about what he was willing to do to get it back. Steve picked up the phone and called Paul Garrett. "I need your help sooner than I expected," he said. He did not tell Paul what had been done to the garage. He did not need to. What mattered now was simple. Henshaw was running out of patience, and Steve was running out of time. Paul Garrett had been at his desk every morning for 20 years by 6 a.m., and wore his shoes until the soles were thin, and thought people who displayed their awards prominently were announcing something they should be more modest about. He was accurate in the way that requires work and courage, and a willingness to be occasionally unpopular with people who have resources for making unpopularity expensive. He had made enemies in racing circles, and kept the respect of people in his field who understood what accuracy actually costs. Steve laid out the complete picture at a diner in Glendale, a back booth, coffee in thick white mugs. Danny sat at Steve's left, saying what needed to be said in the direct, precise way of someone who has rehearsed a version of the story in his head for 3 years and knows it exactly. Martha was across from them, composed in the specific way of someone who has finally stopped running from something and feels, underneath the fear that remains, something close to relief. Paul listened for the first hour without writing. Then he spent 45 minutes asking focused questions about dates, about who saw what and when, and in what condition, about the chain of custody for the photographs and documents, about what could be independently verified, and what rested solely on personal testimony. He examined each item from the envelope with the care of someone reading in a language he knows well but needs to read slowly. 2 of the photographs are clear enough for a document examiner, he said finally. The ring in the image is distinctive. If Henshaw still possesses it, or if it appears in any dated photograph from the period, you have a foundation that doesn't depend solely on the documents themselves. He looked at the handwritten list. This can be checked against racing records. Arranged finishes show statistical patterns when someone looks at the data without the results being the question they're trying to answer. Martha will testify, Steve said. Paul looked at her. On record, she said. Her voice was clear and even. I have been done with this for longer than I have been willing to admit. Roy Bell's account establishes Danny was followed and didn't leave voluntarily on an ordinary evening, Paul said. It's circumstantial about what happened after, but it puts the self-initiation story under real pressure. He looked at Danny. Your testimony is the core. The confrontation with Dillard, the conversation with Henshaw, the decision to hide the documentation. You need to tell it exactly, without embellishment, prepared for the other side to challenge every detail. I remember it exactly, Danny said. I have thought about it for 3 years. I know, Paul said, simply, professionally. There's an event next month. Henshaw is receiving an award. Yes, Steve said. That's your stage, if you want it, Paul said. It puts everyone in one room, and it makes the public nature of the correction match the public nature of the original damage. He paused. It also means committing to a specific date and being completely ready by then. What do you need? Steve said. 2 weeks. I have a document examiner I trust. I'll pull the racing records from 64 through 66 and have someone look at the result patterns without being told what to look for. I'll talk to Martha formally and record it properly. He looked at Steve. And I need someone in the federal prosecution system who might have a pre-existing interest in the racing circuit. If this has criminal dimensions, I don't want to hand it to a local official who might be connected to the same people. I'll find the right person, Steve said. It was a statement, not a promise. They walked out into the ordinary afternoon, 3 people who had just set something in motion, into unremarkable traffic and mild California air. Nothing about that moment would have looked significant to anyone passing. 2 weeks, that was all they had. And across Los Angeles, in a Pasadena office with framed race programs on the walls, Victor Henshaw was already preparing for the most important evening of his public life, the night he would finally receive the recognition he had spent 15 years arranging for himself. He had no idea what was coming through the door. The California Classic Automotive Celebration was held in the Wilshire District, in a banquet hall that had hosted the important events of people who considered themselves important for 50 years, high coffered ceilings, original chandeliers, gilt chairs that were beautiful to look at and uncomfortable to sit in, a low stage, with a podium at the far end. 300 people, collectors, sponsors, drivers, officials, and a generous contingent whose connection to racing was primarily financial. Victor Henshaw arrived 20 minutes before the program. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who has prepared for an evening and knows its shape in advance. He shook hands with measured warmth. He accepted compliments with the modesty that is itself a kind of performance, done well enough that most people don't recognize it as one. Leonard Pierce stayed close, slightly behind, in the position he had occupied for 15 years. The program began at 8. Awards started at 9:30. 2 other genuine recognitions for genuine people occurred first. The room was warm, with the good feeling of an evening going smoothly. Victor Henshaw's name was called at 10:15. He walked to the stage slowly, deliberately, the way a man walks when he knows every eye in the room is on him and he has earned the right to take his time. The applause was full and confident. 300 people who trusted the committee, trusted the name on the plaque, trusted the story they had been told about this man for 15 years. The citation was read with admiration. Words like distinguished, dedicated, visionary. Words Victor had helped choose years ago when he had first conceived of this award and arranged to be its recipient. He stood at the podium and held the crystal award and smiled the smile of a man who has spent a great deal of his life making sure the world sees exactly what he wants it to see. He thanked several people by name, carefully chosen, publicly flattering, privately strategic. He spoke about his love for independent racing. He spoke about the importance of community and legacy. He was 2 sentences into his prepared remarks about the future when the main door of the banquet hall opened. No announcement, no noise. Just a door opening and a man walking through it. Danny Mercer was 31 years old. He had recently cut his hair and was wearing clean dark clothes. He stood in the doorway with the specific quality of someone who has decided, after 3 years of hiding, of disappearing, of being erased, to be fully and completely present. He did not look around the room. He looked at the stage. The ripple moved through the 300 people the way ripples always move, outward from the point of contact, gathering speed. Most people in the room knew Danny Mercer's name only through the story that had been told about him. But the older members of the racing community, the ones who had been present in 1965 and 1966, who remembered the version of the story before Henshaw's version replaced it, some of them recognized his face. And the recognition traveled. Henshaw, at the podium, with the Crystal Award in his hands, and 300 people waiting for his next word, saw Danny Mercer standing in the doorway of the room. He held for one more sentence the instinct of a man who has spent 15 years never letting anyone see him react. Then he stopped. The room went quiet in the gradual way of a large space that has not been given a signal for silence and is choosing it anyway because something has shifted. From the 7th row, Steve McQueen stood up. "Victor," he said, his voice carried without effort. "There's someone here I think you recognize." Henshaw looked at Danny. His polished expression moved through several things quickly and settled on something careful. "I am in the middle of a presentation," Henshaw said. "You are," Steve said. "So is he." Standing near the stage door was Harold James, introduced to the event staff earlier as a guest of Paul Garrett's. He was a federal prosecutor who had spent the previous 10 days reviewing documentation delivered to his office by Paul Garrett, listening to Martha Calloway's recorded formal testimony, reading Roy Bell's sworn statement, and consulting with 2 independent document examiners about the contents of a canvas-wrapped envelope that had spent 3 years hidden behind the dashboard of a dark blue Shelby Cobra. Harold James stepped forward and identified himself by name and title without drama. He explained that he was present as part of an inquiry into financial fraud and race fixing in California's independent motorsports circuit, and that the inquiry had produced documentation sufficient to proceed formally. The room reacted the way rooms do when the floor shifts beneath them, not with chaos, but with a collective, involuntary stillness, followed by the low, spreading sound of people whispering to the person beside them. Chairs turned. Eyes moved. The photographers along the perimeter, who had been half asleep since the dinner service ended, raised their cameras. At the table nearest the stage, 2 of Henshaw's longtime sponsors exchanged a look and said nothing to each other, which was its own kind of statement. 3 rows back, a regional race commissioner who had attended every one of these evenings for 12 years quietly placed his program face down on the table. Leonard Pierce had gone pale in the specific way of a man who has spent years calculating odds and has just watched them collapse. He did not move toward the stage. He did not speak. He sat very still, his hands flat on the table, as though keeping himself anchored. Henshaw, at the podium, still held the Crystal Award. He had not put it down. His posture remained correct, chin level, shoulders back, the practiced composure of a man who has never allowed a room to see him react. But his eyes moved slowly across the faces turning toward him, and in those eyes, for just a moment, something that was not composure passed through. The room was not turning against him loudly. It was doing something quieter and more final. It was turning away from him. Slowly, by degrees, with the particular silence of people who are reconsidering something they thought they understood. Martha Calloway stood up at the back table. She stated her name clearly, her former position with Frank Dillard's team. She said she had first-hand knowledge of the financial arrangements described in documents now in the federal prosecutor's possession, and that she was prepared to provide complete testimony. Roy Bell sat at the same table, solid and entirely still. He had driven 2 hours from Barstow in his best old suit because a young man he had met once at a gas pump at night deserved a witness. He seemed completely at peace with the decision. Steve walked toward the stage, stopped in front of it. looked up at Henshaw for a moment, while the room around them was loud with 300 people all trying to understand what they were witnessing. "He never took anything from you," Steve said quietly. "Only the nearest people heard it. You know that." Henshaw said nothing. "And now everyone else is going to know it too," Steve said. He turned and walked back to the table where Danny was standing. He stood beside him. The Crystal Award sat on the podium, still catching the chandelier light. For the first time all evening, no one was looking at it. The cemetery outside Barstow was quiet in the way that places become quiet when enough time has passed and most of the visiting has already happened. It was October. The desert in October holds a specific kind of cold, not the cold of wind, but the cold of openness, of space, that releases its heat the moment the sun angles away. The sky was white near the horizon and pale blue overhead, the kind of sky that is not dramatic but is entirely without pretense. The silence was the complete, undemanding silence of a place that requires nothing from the people who come to it. Earl Mercer's grave was a flat stone, simple and square, set flush with the ground, his name, his dates. Beneath them, 3 words that Danny had chosen through a letter sent through a lawyer in the months after the event in Los Angeles. Served, returned, remained. Someone had left a small American flag near the base of the stone. It had weathered through seasons, faded but not fallen. Danny stood in front of the stone without speaking. Steve stood several feet behind and slightly to the side, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the middle distance with the practiced patience of someone who knows when a moment belongs to another person entirely and has learned to leave it alone. The investigation had moved the way these things move, when the documentation is real and the witnesses are willing, slowly at first, then with momentum that becomes difficult to stop. Paul Garrett's story had run in 3 regional papers and been picked up nationally. Victor Henshaw had retained counsel and declined all public comment. Leonard Pierce had been suspended from his consulting practice. Frank Dillard had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration, which provided the institutional corroboration that the financial documents needed. Martha Calloway had given her full formal testimony and said, afterward, that she felt physically lighter than she had in years. She said it like a woman reporting a change she had not quite expected. Roy Bell had given his sworn statement and driven back to Barstow the same evening, stopping for fuel at his own station on the way home. Danny's legal identity had been restored through a process managed by a lawyer named Grace Abernathy, paperwork, patience, a hearing before a judge who asked careful questions and then signed what needed signing. Daniel Mercer existed again. On paper, in records, in the world. He was starting over in the slow, practical, real way that starting over actually works one day at a time, no dramatic restoration, but a floor underneath him. He reached into his coat and took out the key, the small key on a plain metal ring that Roy Bell had carried for 3 years in a drawer at his station and that Steve had returned to Danny on the drive back from Bakersfield. When the two of them had driven without talking much but with the windows down and the radio off, which was the right way to make that particular drive, Danny crouched down and placed the key carefully at the base of the stone, leaning it against the face beside the American flag. He rested his hand on the stone for a moment. It was cold, smooth, permanent in the way that only certain things are. He stood up. He turned to Steve. He would have said it wasn't about him, Danny said. He would have said a man's name belongs to what he does, not to what other people say about him. He would have been right about that, Steve said. But it was still about him. And he deserved to know. He deserved to hear it from me, Danny said. Yes, Steve said. He did not offer an alternative comfort. He simply agreed, which was the more honest thing to do. They stood for a while. The desert was empty in every direction. A hawk moved across the pale sky above them, crossing without a sound, until it was gone. Danny looked at the stone one more time at his father's name, at the 3 words beneath it, and thought about a man who had flown 2 wars and come home and raised a son alone and died not knowing that the son had tried. That was the thing that could not be corrected now. That was the permanent damage in this story, and Danny had learned, in 3 years of living beside a loss he couldn't name, that some permanent damages have to be carried rather than fixed. You carry them, and you keep going. I have to decide what to do with the Shelby, he said. Steve looked at him. It's your car, Steve said. It was always your car. I bought it for $1 because I needed the truth to still be there when someone went looking for it. That is the only reason I raised my hand. "You did more than that," Danny said. "No," Steve said. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who means it exactly. "The truth was already in the car. You put it there. All I did was make sure nobody buried it again." They walked back through the dry grass to the parking area. The Shelby was there, dark blue against the pale desert gravel. The morning light came across it at an angle that found the faded paint and did something honest with it. Not restoration, not beauty exactly, but something true. The dented fender that had never been pulled. The windshield replaced but not disguised. The worn paint that still showed, in certain light, the color it had been when a 22-year-old mechanic had chosen it deliberately because it suited the car. A car that had been through something terrible, that had carried the truth through 3 years of desert heat and cold and silence, that was still here. Danny put his hand on the roof and let it rest there without speaking. Steve watched him. He thought about a man named Earl Mercer, who had lived alone in a house with a leaking roof and a photograph turned to face the wall, who had gone to his grave carrying a version of his son that was not his son. He thought about the specific cruelty of that, not the cruelty of violence, but the cruelty of a lie maintained long enough to outlast the people it was told to. Some truths arrive too late to save everything. This one had arrived too late for Earl, but it had arrived in time for Danny, and for the name Danny carried, and for what that name would mean going forward. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. "Race it," Steve said. "Finish what you started." He got in his truck and started the engine. He looked at Danny through the window one last time, the young mechanic who had fixed a carburetor by sound in a desert parking lot, who had tried to do the right thing and paid 3 years for it, who was standing now at his father's grave with his hand on a car he had built himself and thought he would never see again. Steve gave him a single nod. Danny nodded back. Steve pulled onto the road heading west. In the mirror, Danny was still beside the Shelby, one hand on the roof, face turned into the morning. The cemetery fell away behind them. The desert opened up. The sky turned from pale to gold as the sun cleared the eastern hills. No radio, no noise, just the engine and the road, and the long honest silence of the desert doing what it always did, holding everything that happened on it without judgment and without erasure. Somewhere behind him, in a small cemetery outside Barstow, a key rested against a gray stone. It would stay there through rain and wind and the long cold nights of the desert winter. The letters scratched into the ring would fade year by year, becoming harder to read, eventually invisible. That was all right. The men who needed to read them already had, and the car that had carried them was back on the road where it belonged. Some truths arrive late, but they arrive.